the palace at 4 o'clock in the morning, as you see, it's a totally disaggregated order. There is no longer a sense of synthesis, rather there is a complete shattering of the constituent objects of the palace. It's an important piece of work because it relates to the next, which is also by Giacometti, where now these different objects have actually landed onto a platform. So instead of the rigid hierarchical, vertical order of the Soviet palace, we have a sort of shattered grouping of disaggregated elements that have no possibility to really engage each other, except for the fact that they establish an interstitial space, which over time will become very important. Now, this image is also the introductory image for Gideon in his last book, Architecture and the Phenomenon of Transition, when describing a concept called group design. And group design is basically, and I have to make it shorter here, an assemblage of monuments. So what an assemblage of things, no longer a single gesture that combines, or a single order that unifies everything within itself, but rather something that on purpose has certain disaggregation. It's interesting that Gideon, well, taking a cue from surrealism, because Giacometti was in a sense surrealist, and by the way, Rosalind Krause, who you referred to, also described Giacometti as this project by Giacometti, the previous one, as one of the most innovative moments of his work. I mean, we all know the long, elongated vertical figures of Giacometti, but in the sense of verticality, it really makes place for a more horizontal move, horizontalizing move. Gideon then also goes on to explain group design from a completely different angle. So rather than primitive surrealism and the assemblage, he actually says, well, if we go back to the Acropolis in Greece, there's something distinctly interesting going on. In this complex, there is again not a single overarching form. There's actually a series of almost pavilions. And in fact, I mean, he goes on to analyze like 12 acropolises around the Aegean Sea, claiming that each of, I mean, he builds on the work of Doxiadis, claiming that each of them have, in a sense, a similar principle, that from each point of view in the complex, you at least see 2 or 3 totally different monuments at the same time. Furthermore, that between the monuments, reality, the city, is being framed. So the thing, the project, the complex, never becomes an autonomous gesture, merely serves as a way to frame what surrounds you and to better understand, or in a particular way, what surrounds you. Plus, of course, there is a systematic pluriformity of monuments, not a singularity of them. So this is totally against singularity, and he also then builds a case against academicism. Yesterday we had the argument about sort of neoclassical turn that Oliver Till, whose work I love, presented. And even Le Corbusier was being recuperated as a classicist. But basically there was a big argument going on in these guys' work against academicism, the classicism, and this what Gideon called sterile pomp. So the result of this is that very soon, by 1944, there is a project, this is by Le Corbusier, for Saint-Dié, a French town, where we have a platform on which are a series of objects scattered. I could go into the history of the Soviet, of Le Corbusier's design of the Soviet palace, as how it relates to it, but I won't do that right now. But basically the claim I would like to make is that the static order of the Soviet palace by Iofan, which in a sense is the exemplification of a completely singular architecture, and in that way also exemplification of a particular political ideology, is now being broken down, really shattered and regrouped in the service of a different project, which is post-war liberalism. So I need to say a word about liberalism, particularly as it relates to the work of Isaiah Berlin. So what Berlin basically claims is that the notion, the big idea of the Enlightenment project, which would somehow be basically to establish a space of reason, where you and I can discuss our differences in a distant manner, without private concerns, without our own interests, and that we would be able to engage in pure rational exchange. And of course, Berlin doesn't believe in it. Berlin himself comes from the almost counter-Enlightenment tradition, the Romanticist tradition, which basically states the opposite, that there is no real finding of each other possible, only one exists within a certain cultural frame, a certain understanding of the world, and all we can hope for is some kind of empathy in trying to understand the viewpoint of the other, but you will never actually be able to enter it. So, it's a very completely different situation. Instead of a sort of a singular space, which is established by logic or reason or somehow some objective field which we can find, all we have is cries into emptiness by people locked up in their own understanding of the world. And really, this is this in the end then becomes the project of liberalism and pluralism. In Berlin's case, a very agonized pluralism, a pluralism of people who each are, or groups or communities, each really convinced of their own righteousness, but by virtue of simply realizing that every group has a different sense of righteousness, unavoidably at some moment the negotiation is forced. So where this ultimately leads to sort of a global peace, peace through understanding, all this ever allows for is a truce, and a series of truces, but never sort of fully coming together. There's sort of not yet, there's the idea of a collective form, a really public form, is in this sense made impossible in the liberalist tradition. This is also, I just want to quote for a moment Kenneth Frampton when he wrote the Laudatio text for Fumihiko Maki when he got the Pritzker Prize. And Frampton actually says what we have here is the Blochian not yet, the incapacity for Maki in this project, for instance, to really establish a sort of unification, a singular architecture, an architecture that has reconciled differences or even has kind of just dropped back, but simply a sort of contour of what could once happen. But there is no unification here, there is merely a sort of grouping of different units. This is a fantastic project of in Albany, New York. I'll just pass through this thing. And by Xavier de Geiter's project for the European Crossroads in Brussels. This is the opening for the New Jersey project. I want to say one last thing, though, about the notion of this, the grouping, the assemblage of monuments, which actually becomes, instead of assemblage, becomes really a particular assembly, which is a very liberal term, the assembly of different constituents, different interests. So what we have is the notion of a platform or a public space, which is created simply by the juxtaposition or the placing in close proximity of completely irreconciled monumental debris, each almost pertaining to a particular interest group, yelling to each other, yet never really reconciling it and coming together, just saying, being next to each other. There is an argument about modernism here. As you know, Umberto Eco, when he wrote his own aesthetic theory of modernism, in the open work, basically posited that the essence of the modernist work is its inexhaustibility of interpretation, so that the level of its abstraction was such that you could never completely appropriate it. There always remained a level of construction by the beholder of what this thing actually means to you. It was never prescribed. It was never exhausted in terms of its meaning. So the claim that appears now through this assemblage of monuments is that actually the object in itself is exhausted. The object in itself is no longer capable of producing this inexhaustible source of interpretations, and that the only thing that can do it is the grouping of objects, the one which not even arrives at a level of unification and consistency that it can be read as such, but it merely offers a contour, an almost, a not yet. That's for theories. Now I'll just run through the project for New Jersey. So New Jersey is an attempt to contemporarize the theory of the liberal project. And this was, I lived in America twice, once in the 90s, and so now again. And I found the change terrible. I mean, it's a completely different country. I love America, which is why I'm there. I have lots of issues with Europe, which is not here. But the country, I really also feel really, and I feel indebted to it, but I find it really also that it's in deep trouble right now. Because of this, obviously. There is a sort of, there has been, now the tide may be turning, but there has been a kind of crypto-fascism, and which really, brings up the notion of a liberal project, a redefinition with strong intent of liberalism in the face of a rising tide of fascism, once more relevant. This is, I guess, what, as you can see, what has been happening. So on the one hand, we have the propaganda machine, the media machines that are running and delivering stuff like this. And on the other hand, you have a reality, which on the ground, in the middle ring suburbs of America, becomes increasingly problematic. We have a de facto impoverishment of the middle class, vis-a-vis 30 years ago. we have a new phenomenon which actually doesn't have an English